The Pacific War had not yet reached its final collapse when the first contingents of Japanese prisoners of war began to drift toward the scattered chain of American-administered camps across the Pacific. Among them, the Hawaiian installations would become the most paradoxical places of confinement that defied the expectations of those who arrived, carrying with them the imprint of militarist discipline, hunger, and the specter of annihilation. Their journey began far from the tranquil edges of Oahu. Captured sailors from shattered destroyers, airmen pulled from the sea, and soldiers taken on outlying islands were gathered in makeshift holding areas, temporary depots of humanity erected by a war machine still in motion. The prisoners had been conditioned to imagine the United States as merciless, a nation of excess and cruelty. Their indoctrination had prepared them for humiliation, starvation, or execution. For weeks before capture, they rehearsed death more readily than surrender. To live under American guard was itself a contradiction of all they had been told. When the transports left the battle zones, the atmosphere was silent and expectant. The holds smelled of oil, salt, and rusted steel. Armed Marines stood watch as the prisoners sat motionless, eyes lowered, their bodies arranged with mechanical precision. The sea around them stretched into an indifference that seemed to erase their past identity. They did not know that their destination was Hawaii. Neither the island's name nor their geography carried meaning in their exhausted minds. What awaited them was an image, still abstract, of the enemy's interior world. For the Americans aboard, the cargo was both a symbol and a responsibility. The prisoners represented intelligence to be gathered, proof of victory, and the moral test of a democratic army. In quiet moments, some guards observed how the Japanese men behaved, not with open defiance, but with the rigid composure of soldiers unwilling to surrender even in posture. They ate without complaint, followed orders with mechanical efficiency, and kept their gaze fixed somewhere inward. As the convoy neared Oahu, dawn revealed the volcanic silhouette of the island through a film of mist. The coastline appeared almost serene, fringed by green ridges and coral shallows. The prisoners' faces showed no recognition, only a subtle tightening of features, a preparation for whatever form of punishment awaited. They expected to be paraded, mocked, or executed publicly for propaganda. The American military, by contrast, had prepared a reception entirely different in character, one governed by the Geneva Convention, efficiency, and a desire to demonstrate the moral superiority of order over fanaticism. When they disembarked at Pearl Harbor, the harbor itself bore the scars of the war's opening strike. Half-sunken ships, their hulls warped by flame, lay embedded in the water like iron skeletons. The prisoners saw this vista through lowered eyes, each one carrying within him the unspoken realization that this ruin was the consequence of their own nation's ambitions. The guards did not shout. Orders were issued quietly. The men were counted, processed, and placed into waiting trucks. The ride inland was their first exposure to the contradiction that would define their captivity. The landscape of Hawaii was not the desolate ruin they had imagined of enemy territory. It was fertile, bright, and strangely unmilitarized beyond the perimeters of the bases. Civilian workers moved freely. Fields of sugarcane rippled in the wind. For men raised in an empire of scarcity, the abundance seemed alien, almost indecent. At the camp's gates, barbed wire stretched in clean lines under the sunlight, the prisoners prepared themselves for degradation. They expected beatings, interrogations, or starvation. What they encountered instead was bureaucracy. Names were recorded phonetically. Uniforms were replaced with standardized denim. Medical officers examined them methodically, not cruelly. The guards offered water, soap, and in some cases cigarettes, These gestures produced confusion, not gratitude. For men who had been taught that capture was equivalent to dishonor, such civility felt like an extension of shame. Inside the camp, the air smelled of earth and disinfectant. Barracks lined up in precise formation, each with neatly painted numbers. The prisoners were shown their quarters' wooden huts with cots, blankets, and a communal wash area. It was a functional world, not a punitive one. Yet, precisely because it lacked overt hostility, it unsettled them more deeply. That first night, the island wind moved gently through the cracks of the barracks. Many could not sleep. They lay on their bunks, staring upward, their minds filled with questions that no one dared articulate. If this was captivity, why was it so orderly? Why were their captors not gloating? Why were they still alive? Morning brought the routines of confinement roll call, breakfast, work assignments, but with daylight came an additional layer of dissonance. The meals were sufficient. Bread, coffee, and rice appeared on trays carried by American cooks. The act of being fed by the enemy was unbearable to some. They refused the food until exhaustion forced compliance. Others, weaker or more pragmatic, ate silently, trying to decipher the motives behind such treatment. As the day progressed, the camp revealed its peculiar rhythm. There were guards, but no overt violence. There were boundaries, but within them a kind of fragile autonomy. The Americans spoke little. Their restraint itself became a form of discipline. To the prisoners, it was an incomprehensible civility that masked potential danger. In later years, historians would note that the Hawaiian camps were among the most organized in the Pacific theater. They served as a logistical node, not an arena of retribution. Yet to those who lived that first day, the impression was one of psychological rupture. Every assumption about the enemy's cruelty disintegrated. The realization that the Americans adhered to a structure of rules, even toward those they had been taught to despise, was both humiliating and strangely humanizing. The prisoners' disbelief was not relief. It was a confrontation with the collapse of ideology. They had entered a system that functioned without hatred, and that, paradoxically, made their defeat undeniable. The days that followed blended into a slow, almost antiseptic rhythm. The prisoners, still disoriented by the contrast between expectation and reality, began to observe the structure around them as if it were an alien ecosystem. Every motion within the camp had purpose and proportion. The guards rotated shifts according to a precise schedule. Meals arrived at fixed hours. Medical inspections were conducted with impersonal diligence. Even the punishments, rare and formalized, were administrative rather than brutal. For men accustomed to hierarchy and command, the system's impersonality was more unsettling than overt aggression. There was no emotional register to navigate, no hatred to resist. The Americans' restraint left the prisoners suspended between gratitude and unease. They searched for hidden motives, propaganda, psychological warfare, or the prelude to some greater humiliation. None emerged. The camp itself was bordered by open fields, with the Pacific visible beyond the far ridges. The climate was temperate, the soil fragrant with vegetation. Prisoners assigned to labor detachments worked in agricultural plots under supervision, tending crops that would partly sustain the camp's own food supply. To them, it seemed impossible that war still raged across the ocean. The sound of the surf, the sight of distant palm trees, and the organized monotony of their work blurred the line between confinement and survival. At night, the barracks hummed with the low murmur of insects. Some men began to write. Tiny fragments of letters never sent, notes to imagined recipients, diaries kept in secret. They documented the strangeness of the situation, the absence of cruelty, the coexistence of dignity and defeat. In the coded language of their writings, they expressed the sensation of being suspended outside history. The Americans, for their part, regarded the prisoners through a lens of professional detachment. Many guards were young recruits who had never seen combat. They had been instructed that discipline, not vengeance, would maintain control. In internal reports, officers described the Japanese as highly organized, deferential, industrious. There was no mention of hatred. The distance between captor and captive was maintained not through violence, but through procedure. The paradox of the Hawaiian camps lay precisely in their efficiency. The system worked too well. It allowed no space for rebellion, yet it also offered no outlet for emotion. For the prisoners, every act of normalcy, the provision of food, the medical care, the structured work, became a silent reminder of their nation's collapse. The enemy they had been told was barbaric had proven more orderly, more consistent, perhaps even more humane than their own regime had been to them. Rumors circulated that other prisoners elsewhere were suffering far worse. Whether these reports were true or not hardly mattered. Within the barbed wire, perception itself had become the battleground. The men compared their treatment to the imagined horrors they had expected. The absence of cruelty was interpreted as a calculated gesture of superiority, a demonstration that American civilization could conquer not only armies, but moral ground. Weeks passed. The camp population stabilized. Medical officers recorded weight gain among the malnourished. Disease, a constant companion in wartime Asia, was almost non-existent here. The prisoners began to understand that survival was possible, perhaps even probable. Yet this knowledge carried its own burden. To live comfortably under enemy supervision was, in their cultural code, a deeper form of shame than dying heroically in battle. Morning inspections became the camp's heartbeat. The men lined up in perfect rows, not because they were forced to, but because the precision of their formation was the last vestige of self-respect. The Americans noted this with quiet approval, interpreting it as discipline rather than despair. They could not fully grasp that, for these men, formality had replaced belief. In the afternoons, the prisoners worked on maintenance projects, repairing fences, building storage sheds, clearing brush. Some were trained artisans, and their skill impressed the American officers. The camp administration began assigning them specialized tasks: carpentry, metalwork, tailoring. In return, the men were given modest privileges: extra soap, books, or access to newspapers that had been screened by censors. These exchanges, though routine, slowly reintroduced the concept of reciprocity into a context that had begun as absolute domination. There were no celebrations, no expressions of joy, but small gestures of adaptation emerged. The men swept their barracks with ritual precision. They constructed makeshift shrines from pebbles and twigs. They greeted the guards with formal bows, maintaining an etiquette that functioned as both resistance and surrender. Beyond the wire, the war moved toward its conclusion. News filtered through indirectly fragments of radio reports overheard from American personnel, or hints in the changing tone of the guards' conversations. When the European front ended, the camp remained quiet. There were no announcements. Yet the men felt the shift, the subtle loosening of tension in the air. By the time the first rumors of Japan's impending defeat reached them, disbelief had already become a familiar condition. The war's moral geography had inverted itself. The captors behaved according to a code of fairness. The prisoners, once loyal to a divine emperor, now confronted the uncertainty of survival without purpose. The first day in the camp had been a shock of kindness. The subsequent weeks were a slow education in contradiction. They had expected cruelty and found order. They had prepared for martyrdom and were given sustenance. Every element of their captivity negated the moral universe they had inhabited. When American officers walked through the camp during inspections, they observed quiet men performing their duties with exact precision. No one smiled, no one protested. The calmness was absolute, yet within it lay the silent recognition that their captors had stripped them of even the dignity of suffering. In later years, accounts from both sides would converge on a single observation. The Japanese prisoners in Hawaii never ceased to be astonished by the civility of their treatment. The Americans regarded this civility as a matter of procedure. The Japanese experienced it as an existential paradox. Between those two perceptions stretched the entire moral distance of the Pacific War. As months passed, the camp became its own small civilization, an island within an island. The rhythm of confinement acquired seasons of its own: planting, harvest, inventory, inspection. The prisoners learned the gestures of routine so thoroughly that each day seemed to repeat the first. Yet beneath this regularity, an invisible transformation took place. Fear was replaced by reflection. Disbelief matured into comprehension. By late 1945, the air around Hawaii carried a different soundless of engines, more of waves and radio static. Rumors of atomic destruction arrived not as words, but as a change in expression on the guards' faces. The prisoners sensed that the world outside the wire had crossed a threshold. When official notice of Japan's surrender reached the camp, it came without ceremony. A typed announcement was read by an interpreter. The men stood motionless as if the meaning could not attach itself to language. No one cheered, and no one protested. The moment passed like a shadow. In the following days, the routines continued, but something imperceptible had shifted. The guards moved with a subdued professionalism. The prisoners, now technically no longer combatants, became witnesses to the dissolution of the purpose that had sustained them. Their disbelief, once directed at the Americans' restraint, now turned inward toward their own survival. They began to understand that captivity, once a moral wound, had become a form of continuity. The world that had condemned them to death for surrender no longer existed. Documents from the period record few incidents of disorder. Instead, there was a deep quiet, broken only by the sounds of work and wind. Some prisoners volunteered for additional labor construction, road maintenance, agricultural projects that supported the island's recovery. Others withdrew into silence. The American administration noted the high productivity of these units and filed reports describing the experiment as proof that humane treatment produced compliance. Yet the reports could not capture the inner dimension of what was taking place. Men rebuilding a world they no longer recognized. Occasionally, visiting officials from the mainland arrived to inspect conditions. They found the camp neat, its inhabitants orderly, its records precise. The contrast with the imagery of wartime propaganda was striking. Photographs taken at the time grainy, sun-washed show Japanese men in work clothes, standing beside freshly painted fences, faces expressionless but calm. The images circulated through military channels as evidence of successful management. They did not show the long hours of stillness in the barracks, when men stared through the mesh of the windows toward a horizon that refused to answer. When repatriation finally began, the process unfolded with the same precision that had governed every other aspect of their captivity. Lists were prepared, medical examinations repeated, personal effects inventoried. Each man was issued clothing and travel documents stamped with the seal of the U.S. Army. For many, this was the first paper that bore their name without the authority of the emperor. The act of signing it was both bureaucratic and existential, a signature acknowledging survival. Departure from Hawaii was quiet. Trucks carried the men back to the docks, where they had first arrived in disbelief more than a year earlier. The ships waiting for them were American transports refitted for repatriation. They boarded without ceremony. The guards saluted them formally, not as enemies, but as men whose role in history had ended. The sea, once the space of battle, now became the corridor of return. Those who left carried with them impressions too complex for easy narration. In later testimonies, recorded after the war, former prisoners would describe the first day in the Hawaiian camp as the moment when everything they had been taught collapsed. They spoke of the shock of food, of water freely given, of medical care without condescension. Some said that the sight of American order clean, efficient, unboastful, had forced them to reconsider the nature of strength. Others admitted that kindness had been harder to bear than cruelty. A few never reconciled the experience, insisting that captivity had been an illusion designed to humiliate them by undermining their certainty. The American officers who had administered the camps also left records. Their tone was pragmatic, their language bureaucratic. They described logistical successes, minimal incidents, good health statistics. But in private correspondence, some reflected on the visible confusion of the prisoners, the way their stoicism cracked, not under punishment, but under comfort. They realized, perhaps without intending to, that the moral architecture of war had revealed its instability. Discipline and humanity were not opposites, but parallel forms of control. After repatriation, most of the Hawaiian prisoners disappeared into the anonymity of post-war Japan. They returned to a nation flattened both physically and psychologically. For them, the memory of captivity did not fit the new narratives of peace or victimhood. It remained a private geography, a place where the boundaries between conqueror and conquered had blurred. A few wrote memoirs, limited in circulation, describing the camp not as a prison, but as a mirror in which they first saw the outlines of a world without empire. In American archives, the Hawaiian camps occupy a small footnote: efficient, well-run, largely uneventful. Yet within that uneventfulness lay a quiet drama of perception. The disbelief of the prisoners on their first day was not merely astonishment at comfort. It was the first step in a process of moral disassembly. They had entered expecting barbarism and found a system that functioned without hatred. That realization, more than defeat itself, marked the end of their war. When historians later traced the arc of the Pacific conflict, the Hawaiian camps appeared as minor logistical details between battles. But for the men who lived behind their fences, those spaces became the threshold between two civilizations, one built on obedience and sacrifice, the other on procedure and restraint. The encounter did not reconcile the two, but it exposed the fragile line between ideology and humanity. Years afterward, veterans who had once been guards on Oahu would recall the faces of the Japanese prisoners, silent, disciplined, unfailingly polite. They remembered how disbelief softened into comprehension, and how comprehension turned into an uneasy respect. The prisoners' first day had become their most enduring memory, a day that began with fear of cruelty and ended with the recognition that mercy itself could be disorienting. In the quiet of those tropical evenings, when the light fell across the barracks and the surf carried the smell of salt and hibiscus through the wire, the prisoners saw not victory or defeat, but the strange neutrality of survival. The Americans called it order. The Japanese called it fate. History would later call it a brief pause between the violence of the old world and the uncertain ethics of the new. Their disbelief never entirely faded. It remained embedded in the recollections of those who had once believed that to be captured was to cease existing. Instead, in Hawaii, they discovered a different form of existence, one measured not by honor or shame, but by endurance, procedure, and the faint, unsettling mercy of the enemy. In that realization, the Pacific War truly ended, not with surrender or declaration, but with the quiet astonishment of men who, for the first time, learned what it meant to live in the aftermath.